Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the KDI School World Bank monthly webinar series. My name is Yeonji Kim, and I'll be serving as your MC for today's webinar. Before we get started, please note that today's webinar will be recorded for knowledge sharing purposes. This webinar is our joint venture with the World Bank, where experts from the World Bank will share their recent findings with the school community. We hope you'll gain exclusive insights into the cutting-edge research by the bank and have time to reflect on possible applications. If you have any questions or comments, please wait for the Q&A session or leave your messages in the Q&A box. Now, I'm pleased to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Franz Ruch. He is a senior economist in the World Bank's Fiscal Policy Unit. His work has focused on fiscal and monetary policy. Prior to joining the World Bank, Dr. Ruch was an economist at the South African Reserve Bank, where he contributed to the bank's forecasting, macroeconomic modeling, and the monetary policy report. He holds a master from Oxford University and PhD from the University of Stellenbosch. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Franz Ulrich Ruch. Dr. Ruch, please share your slides when you're ready to begin.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, and good morning to you all in Korea. Let me share. Everybody can see my slides, yes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So today I'll be speaking about fiscal policy's role in economic resilience to climate shocks. This is a paper that I wrote with Armin Rezai, Rishab Chowdhury, and John Francois. Two of those are at the World Bank. The other is from Vienna University. And we're trying to explore really the intersection of fiscal policy and climate, specifically looking and trying to understand its role in economic resilience. This research exists in two forms. One, you can see them here. One is a World Bank policy research paper, and in another form as another working paper. And you can feel free to go Google those and try to pick them up and read them if you're interested. And let me get into the question and sort of the motivation of this work. So the question we're going to ask today and try to answer today is questions. Are there threshold and compound risks from climate shocks? And how do those affect the economy? And what is the role of fiscal policy in ameliorating those threshold and compound risks? And I'll get into the definition of those a little bit later. But really, why do we care about this? Well, climate impacts are becoming increasingly severe on developing economies. Although the US, of course, is not a developing economy, I think everybody is aware of the fires, the wildfires that have engulfed California. And those fires are said to be one of the most expensive natural disaster in US history. So clearly, these sort of climate impacts, these natural disasters that are a manifestation of climate change in some way, not entirely, but in some way, are becoming very important. And countries have to be aware of that. Another good example of these kind of climate shocks is what happened to Pakistan in 2022, where it faced one of the worst floods, or I think the worst flood in its history. It affected close to 33 million people. 1,700 people were killed. It cost the economy about 40 billion US dollars. So these natural disasters are getting large and can be very consequential for governments, especially governments that are vulnerable. For example, small states, small island states, where the economies aren't very big and are very vulnerable to climate changes. The other reason why we're doing this work is really policies to mitigate the impact of these shocks is underrepresented in macroeconomic analysis of governments, as well as the international institutions, advising them. Current fiscal policy tools often treat climate damages as unlikely and do not prioritize mitigation and adaptation responses. Of course, nowadays it's slightly different. Some countries are doing a pretty good job of trying to think about climate, bring it into their budget process. For example, I think Korea is doing a pretty good job on this front. Whereas other countries, it's not at all involved in their budget process, and they're thinking of spending, on their thoughts on spending and how they plan spending. And then finally, risks of tipping points. So I'll be speaking about tipping points and threshold risks synonymously. They're sort of this, they're basically mean the same thing. But these risks of tipping points and compound risks are becoming more important. So my presentation today will cover 4 things. First, I'll take you through some climate change basics. This is just to set the stage. It's a little bit disjointed from my presentation and the topic today, but I think it's important just to get everybody on the same page in terms of what I mean or what is meant when people talk about specific things within the climate change sort of world. Second, I'll look at the sort of empirical exercise we did on climate and fiscal policy, the interaction of those two. Then I'll take you into a macroeconomic model, and I'll show you sort of simulations from a small, vulnerable island economy of how climate shock might hit it and impact it, and then how fiscal policy can play a role in mitigating that impact. And then finally, just talk a little bit about policy. So just a quick primer on natural disasters. There's lots of terms that's usually that you get spoken about. And I just want to be specific about all the terms that you might hear today, or you might hear in future related to natural disasters and climate change. So let's start with hazards. Hazards are potential occurrences of a physical event that may cause a loss of life or damage and loss of property or infrastructure. So you can think of those as, the floods, wildfires, droughts that affect all countries, basically. Next is exposure. This is the presence of people or infrastructure or other economic assets in places that could be affected by natural disasters. Then there's vulnerability. This is the propensity to be affected, or the susceptibility to harm, or the lack of an ability to cope or adapt to these shocks. And then finally, the impacts of these shocks or these natural disasters. And that's really the consequences of this realized risks. And this is really the interaction of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. Of course, fiscal policy and policy in general, government's role is really about risk management, right? And risk management is about the plans, actions, strategies, or policies that government is putting into place, that fiscal policy is putting into place to reduce the likelihood or magnitude of the consequences of these natural hazards or any shock. You could think of this in any shock. Of course, you do risk management through mitigation, which is about reducing the impacts through the reduction of a hazard. You do risk management through building resilience, so the capacity or ability to anticipate and cope with shocks and to recover from their impacts. And you do risk management through adaptation by reducing the impacts through the reduction of exposure or vulnerability. Of course, our question is really on understanding threshold risks and compound risks in the context of the macroeconomy from these climate shocks. And so I just want to define what these threshold risks and compound risks are. A threshold risk or a tipping point, and I'll show you a quick video on this that I think is quite useful, is really about an abrupt change, a sudden change in a system's state or behavior after crossing a critical threshold. And the video I'll show you is really about the climate examples of a tipping point or threshold risk. This paper is more, of course, interested in the interpretation of those threshold risks from a macroeconomic perspective, right? So output or an economy at steady state and how you might move that economic system away from that steady state. These threshold risks and this sort of tipping point becomes irreversible. It can be self-reinforcing. And then there are compound risks. Compound risks is really about the interaction of several risks. And you can think about it in the context of climate change and economics as a climate shock or a natural hazard hitting you at the same time that you, for example, faced a recession. So this is really about individual risks interacting and playing out and causing big issues in economy. So now I'll show you a video. It's about 3 minutes long, and then I'll continue after that on this presentation.
Climate tipping points are a growing concern for both scientists and the public, but what are they? How might they affect us? And can we predict them? The Earth's climate is changing, with humanity's carbon dioxide emissions pushing up average temperatures through the greenhouse effect. So far, temperatures have gone up steadily along with CO2 emissions, but future warming may not be gradual. Passing a tipping point can cause rapid change. You can think of tipping points like a seesaw. Pushing the ball up the ramp is like human CO2 emissions pushing temperatures up. Before the pivot is reached, the ball can come back down, but once you pass the tipping point, the ball carries on and speeds up without any further pushing. Eventually, the ball comes to rest in a new steady state, and it is more difficult for it to return. For the climate, this would be the Earth passing a climate tipping point and reaching a new normal as a hotter planet. Tipping points can happen when positive feedback loops kick in. One of these may now be happening with Arctic summer sea ice. Sea ice reflects more energy from the sun back into space than darker open sea, and this keeps the Arctic cooler. But global warming is melting the summer sea ice, which is exposing more open sea, reducing the solar energy reflected by ice, and amplifying local warming. Beyond a future tipping point, the summer sea ice may rapidly retreat, and the whole Arctic will warm up much more than the rest of the world. This feedback loop has already started in the Arctic, and there are many other potential feedback loops linked to climate change. Other possible tipping points that may soon be crossed include ice sheet collapse in West Antarctica, which would raise sea levels, and methane release from melting Arctic permafrost, which as a strong greenhouse gas would amplify global warming. We want to be able to predict tipping points like these in advance, so that we can either avoid triggering them or prepare for the consequences if that's too late. Scientists are using models and records of ancient climate change to find when tipping points may have happened in the past. One example is when ice sheets rapidly melted at the end of the Ice Age glacial periods, despite having been stable for tens of thousands of years. Before these ancient tipping points, subtle changes like increased variability can often be seen, which are known as early warning signals. These are a bit like when a spinning top slows down. It starts to wobble more and more before it finally tips over. We can monitor the climate for wobbles like these using advanced mathematical techniques and then compare them to records of ancient climate tipping points. To find out more about climate tipping points, visit www.climatetippingpoints.info, follow Climate Tip Point on Twitter, or find climatetippingpoints.info on Facebook. This outreach was funded by the Recover Network, which supports research on changes of variability and environmental risk.
So that covered the climate tipping points that we are possibly facing in the future. Of course, this paper isn't about the climate tipping points, but it's really about understanding those dynamics in the context of an economic system, right? So really what we want to understand is threshold and compound risks to output or to employment. And so these charts are really sort of like simple versions of what may occur. And if you were to think of a threshold risk of a change in sort of a steady state outcome, right? If you were to treat that line on the left chart as like steady state growth, right? This is the level of output. You can see that when the climate shock hits, that there's this permanent loss in the level of output. And that can be thought of as a tipping point, for example, right? Of course, in this example, the economy is again growing at its same potential growth rate, right? The slope before and after the climate shock are the same. But clearly there's a permanent loss in output as a consequence of the climate shock. The more worrying story, and the one that probably more clearly reflects a tipping point, is the idea that the economy both loses permanently, but also the steady state growth rate of the economy, right? The slope of that line, how fast income is growing, changes. And effectively, in this right example, you can see the chart on the right, you're getting both the climate shock hitting and then potential growth as a consequence after the shock slowing. And this could be a function of both a threshold risk or a compound risk that causes this kind of outcome. So good examples of these kind of charts is if you were to plot, for example, the global financial crisis, or you were to plot COVID, less so COVID, depending on what country you're looking at, you will see these kind of dynamics in the level of GDP. So let's move on to the actual sort of work we do in the paper, the empirics of climate and fiscal policy. So of course, if we want to test empirically, if we can find these threshold and compound risks, we need some climate shock. And so we're going to use natural disasters, that's floods, droughts, earthquakes, and so on, from the EMDAT database as our definition of a climate shock. And we're going to define that as an intensity measure. So we're going to look at the number of people affected and the number of people that die from these natural disasters, and use that as our climate shock to see what happens to output. Of course, we're interested in the interaction with fiscal policy, and so just not to bury the lead, effectively what we're finding is that climate shocks have long-lasting impacts on output, and that when countries do not have fiscal space or do not have the ability to ramp up spending to meet the size of the shock, you're going to see much more negative impacts from these shocks, from these natural disasters, than if they had the fiscal space available. And the fiscal space is basically just a definition of, there's no like clear definition of fiscal space, but you can think of a country that has very high debt as lacking fiscal space. Or a country that has very low tax revenue collection, and hence when shocks come, doesn't have the ability to spend to address those shocks as lacking fiscal space. Just to kind of get you into the data, this is the underlying data in terms of the percentage of population affected. And you can see that at the 90th percentile, right? So at each point in time, if you did a distribution of these shocks and you looked at the biggest shocks, you can see that over time, the intensity of these natural disasters have been increasing. And also you can see that these natural disasters, these large shocks, tend to disproportionately affect low-income countries. That's on the right chart. You can see that LIC, low-income countries, mainly face the brunt of these large shocks. Much larger percent of their population is affected by those. And as you move up the income scale to lower middle income and upper middle income countries, and even high income countries, you can see less people are affected. So what do we find if we take these shocks and we look at what kind of impact they have on output? And so how we do this is we do a panel local projection model. If you're interested, you can just go Google that or go look at the paper. And we basically shock the level of GDP, and we look at the cumulative impact onto the log level of GDP, right? So then we can interpret this as percent change. And we do this over a number of years. So T+1 to T+8 is 1 to 8 years ahead. And what you can see for when we do this for about 156 countries over 21 years of data, and we do this intensity shock, right? The number of people affected and killed by a natural disaster, what you can see is that the level of GDP remains negative, right? And significantly negative. And this impact is long lasting. So output even 8 years after the shock is still lower as a consequence of that shock. Of course, we want to test for both threshold impacts, right? So we want to look at whether in this context, whether large climate shocks have a larger or more negative impact on GDP. And you can see here, these two panels, this right panel is showing you that there doesn't seem to be empirically evidence necessarily of threshold impacts. But there is some evidence of the possibility of compounding shocks, right? Compound risk. Here we're basically doing a nonlinear version of this model where we're saying, let's check when an economy has a negative output gap, right? They're basically already below potential, their potential growth rate, or a positive output gap, whether when a climate shock hits, it has any impact on, or it has a differential impact on output. And what you can clearly see in these two panels here is that when you have a positive output cap, when a country has a positive output cap and a climate shock hits, there's an initial negative response, but overall you don't see any impact on GDP. However, if you already in the previous period had a negative output gap, you're already below potential. So think of this as like you're in recession. Then you can see clearly this climate shock has a strong negative impact and again, long-lasting impact on your level of output. The other thing we test for is really how does this interact with fiscal policy? And this is a version of your ability to respond to the shock, right? So most interesting and most strong evidence of this lack of fiscal space is really on this left chart. And what you can see here, again, if we use a nonlinear version of this model, right, we divide those countries and periods in time where government debt is above 50% of GDP or below 50% of GDP. We're just using that as a sort of a nominal point. It could be 55, it could be 45. The number does not necessarily have a specific meaning, but when you are in a high debt economy, when this shock hits, you can see there are pretty strong negative impacts from this climate shock relative to when your debt is below a specific level. And basically showing that this government's inability to respond to a climate shock is having a strong negative impact on output. Another version of that is on the right chart, where you can see that if a country on average runs a primary budget surplus or primary budget deficit, that there's differential impacts onto the economy. And on average of countries running a primary budget deficit, that's saying they generally lack fiscal space when the shock hits because they're not running countercyclical policy. We also find that bad fiscal policy, and I use that term loosely, also is associated with largest losses from climate shocks. And on that left chart, you can see we break it between countries that run countercyclical policy and pro-cyclical policy. Generally, fiscal policy wants to be countercyclical, right? It wants to work against the business cycle to support economies during recessions, and then let the private sector do its thing during expansions and pare back and rebuild buffers to deal with the next shock. And again, the case is that those who are running pro-cyclical bad policy tend to see much larger impacts from climate shocks. So now we've gone through the empirical evidence on threshold and compound risk in the context of climate shocks. And now I want to take you into a macro economic model and look at the same sort of exercise in that context. So here we're going to use a small open island economy as an example country. And obviously these economies are particularly vulnerable to external shocks as well as climate shocks. So this is sort of the sort of world we want to test for these threshold and compound macroeconomic risks. And the model we're going to use is the World Bank's macro fiscal model called MF-MOD. And that's a structural econometric model which has lots of features. It has the economy flow of funds, it has sectoral interactions, it has trade dynamics. So it has fiscal policy, it has the government. So it's really a nice sort of world model to try to test some of these dynamics and look at how fiscal policy responds. And of course, we're interested in several questions here. We want to know how the severity of climate risks can have a nonlinear impact on a macroeconomic performance of a country, how the presence of other risks could compound the risk posed by climate change, and how simple adjustments to fiscal policy could possibly mitigate those shocks that hit an economy. And of course, we're standing on the work of others. So we're really using work done by other World Bank staff, Hellegat et al. Paper, Charles Juste in the bank, Florent McIsaac in the bank, and they did a paper effectively looking at when you destroy capital in an economy through a climate shock, how does monetary policy respond? And we're, of course, interested in how does fiscal policy respond, or what role can fiscal policy play in these shocks? So the model effectively has a production function. So output is determined by capital and labor, and you also have technology in that production function. And they split capital into both existing capital and new capital. So effectively what they can do then with a damage function is effectively wipe out a certain percentage of the capital stock that a country uses to produce output, right? So you are taking labor and capital and technology and combining that to create output. And the amount of capital and labor and technology you have really determines how much output you can produce. And so we're going to effectively simulate a climate shock, which is effectively a destruction of that capital stock. And in this table here, you can see we're going to impose a 5% shock to the capital stock. That's at the bottom there. I hope you can see my cursor on the 5%. And then we're going to look at sort of how does this climate shock play out in this economy over the next 30 years. So from year 0 to year 30. And so what I want to show you here is really a capital stock shock where there is no reconstruction. So the government is not rebuilding the destroyed capital. And so what you can see as a consequence is that when the shock hits, the capital stock decreases by 5%. This has an immediate impact on potential GDP, so on your productive capacity in the economy, which declines by 3%. This is all relative to a no shock baseline. And as a consequence of the shock, you can see that on economic activity, private consumption and total investment takes the biggest hit. And in year 1, GDP declines by 2%. As you play out the shock over time, fiscal policy responds. So there's all these interactions in the economy. But what's important to note is that the shock has a long-lasting impact on GDP, right? 30 years after the shock, the level of GDP is still 2% below where if the shock did not happen. So is investment and consumption. The level of potential GDP, right? Your productive capacity in the economy is 1.6% below baseline where there's no shock. So you're having long-lasting impacts, you're destroying your economy's productive capacity, and you're damaging your government's ability to raise revenue as well as to be sustainable, right? Because you're raising debt level and you're decreasing overall revenue intake. So that's how a shock plays out. So of course, this is just a simple version. There's no response to this shock from the government, no active response in trying to reconstruct the capital that was destroyed. But of course, generally what's going to happen is government's going to take its existing public investment and redirect that investment to try to rebuild this capital stock that has been destroyed. And so what you can see in this chart here is the impact of the no reconstruction baseline, which I showed you in the previous table, right? The minus 1.8% loss in output after 30 years, and compares that to one where the government actually redirects half of its public investment, so the public investment that it was going to do anyway into the future, into actually reconstructing the economy. And if that happens, you can see that over this period, although the initial impact is exactly the same after 1 year, 5 years after and 30 years after, there is a smaller overall loss in output as a consequence. So proactive policy is playing a role, but it's still not able to completely undo the shock that hit the economy. So let's ask the question about threshold risks. Do we see any threshold risks in this macroeconomic model? So how we test that is we double the size of the climate shock. So instead of 5% climate shock or capital loss, we're going to look at a 10% capital loss. And what this chart shows you in comparison is that effectively doubling the climate shock basically roughly doubles the loss. So again, there's no evidence of a threshold impact. We haven't found it empirically, and we don't have it in our model either. But of course, that's in the case where there's no reconstruction. But of course, if the government tries to rebuild the lost capital stock, then you start to see the problem that comes. It's really the government isn't able to scale its spending to meet the size of the much larger shock. And so as a consequence, you get a more than double impact from the shock onto the economy after about 30 years, even after 5 years, because government cannot deal with the size of the shock. Of course, there's lots of ways to respond. You can raise debt, you can cut spending, or you can raise revenue, right? You can tax more. So the question is, what policy matters? Which policy gives you sort of the best response to a climate shock? So just to put everybody on the same page, your disaster destroys your capital stock, and then you need to, of course, repair that to restore the productivity of your economy. And then we're going to look at the no reconstruction case, like the no investment case. We're going to look at the case where they reconstruct, but basically by redirecting existing public investment to reconstruction. And then we're going to compare a case where the same level of reconstruction investment happens, but that happens via increasing the level of debt in an economy, or reducing spending, or raising revenue. And so here you can see the different cases based on how you choose to respond. So how you, as a government, want to run fiscal policy. And so what you can see here are the 1 year and 30-year after impacts onto GDP. The no reconstruction and via public investment response that you saw earlier, right? This redirecting your existing investment are exactly the same as you saw prior. So what happens if you choose to respond by raising new debt? What you can quite clearly see is if you do that, you can quite quickly remove some of the impact, most of the impact from this climate shock. Of course, if you bring in, this is the same as like aid. So if another economy is, if the US, for example, steps in to help a small island economy that was hit by a hurricane, its ability to bounce back quickly and return to the level of GDP it had prior is much better than if it just tried to respond with the existing public investment it had. And so the impacts are quite small onto GDP. Of course, the cost is then that you have much higher debt levels as a consequence. And so this only works in an economy that actually has the ability to handle the additional debt. If instead it tried to respond by shifting this away from current spending to investment into reconstruction, so it lowers its spending, its overall government spending on other things, you can see that this tends to magnify the impact of the shock. Of course, over time it pays off, and your baseline 30 years later is better, but you take an initial much bigger hit as a consequence. And then finally, if you raise more revenue, you can again minimize the impact of the shock. So what does this mean for policy? So we have the climate-related disasters that are exacerbating existing economic challenges in developing countries. And of course, there has to be a role for fiscal policy in reducing the economic impacts of those disasters. And so what can be done given the information that I've given you over this presentation, the evidence I've shown you? Well, really, it's about prudent fiscal management. So effectively managing your debt levels and mobilizing additional revenue is what you can do to create domestic revenue, is what you can do to create the fiscal buffers needed. And you can do that via binding fiscal rules or implementing resilient tax policy, reforming your administrative processes and how you collect taxes, and your legal frameworks. You can do that through countercyclical fiscal policies. I showed you that countries that employ countercyclical government spending policies face much smaller and shorter negative impacts from these climate shocks compared to those that ran pro-cyclical spending policies. So this is also a way of building up fiscal space. You can put in fiscal safeguards or instruments and buffers to try to respond. So some buffers you could do as a government is you can build up contingency reserves. You can have a natural disaster fund. You can use insurance mechanisms to manage this. For example, the World Bank has these catastrophe bonds that effectively suspend the repayment of the principal when a certain threshold or some event occurs. And you can ensure that your government is more effective. Obviously, you could do this through more effective fiscal policy formulation and implementation and credible governments commitments. And you can do this by aligning your spending with strategic goals to address these future climate risks. So thank you very much. That's my presentation.